Stand up.
Hi, hello. Thank you for pressing play on today's podcast. Sorry that the last few episodes of Stand Up there had been some kind of editing error. I had a long string where there didn't seem to be too many terrible errors, but I always appreciate it when people tell me what's missing, if I've got sound overlapping, long pauses. I try to edit it and review it as effectively as I can, but I am a one-man show, and sometimes I'm up pretty late doing it, get a little tired, get a little careless, but I apologize for any errors in the podcast, and I always appreciate those of you that listen to the whole thing. Let me know, especially those who do it right when it posts, either at midnight or by 6 a.m. the next morning. Now, with that contrition and confession done, I want to welcome you to my 1,103rd episode of Stand Up. Of course, I can't do it without you listening and supporting with your paid subscription. This is an ad-free podcast. I am supported by you, the listener and subscribers. Sign up now if you haven't already. Patreon.com. You can always pay more if you want. Joining me today, Anya Kamanetz, who is one of the best journalists of our generation, in my opinion, former NPR education journalist, author of 5 very important books, and her new Substack, thegoldenhour.substack.com, is so good and so important. Climate, children, mental health. I invited Anya to join us last week in West Virginia at the National Conservation Training Center for the Fish and Wildlife Agency's Headwaters Camp. Conversation, Climate Change, and Democracy, sponsored also by the Climate Democracy Initiative. So good. So many amazing people there. And today you'll hear my great conversation with Anya Kamanetz in front of a live audience of brilliant scientists and government folks, many of which who will be joining me here on the podcast in the coming weeks. That conversation begins at about 27 minutes into today's show. If you want to skip ahead, but right now I've got your headlines and sound bites for you from yesterday. It's the last 24 hours of news recap by me. All of the most important headlines and stories that matter to you the most, that impact you and your family, your climate, your community, your life, your soul, all of it. Let's do it right now. Yesterday, of course, the big story was Michael Cohen's second day on the stand in the third week of Trump's hush money trial in Manhattan. Of course, that is absolutely overcovered. I mean, MSNBC is on it all day long. They're tweeting out, reading the transcript, covering the conversation as best they can. Obviously, they dream to have cameras in the courtrooms, and I do too, because I think they matter. But of course, I've said every day, I think it's overcovered. I'll mention just a couple of headlines from it and move on to other important stories. New York Times has it this way. Todd Blanche, the lead lawyer defending Donald Trump in his New York criminal trial, wasted no time yesterday before aggressively questioning the prosecution's star witness, Michael Cohen. He opened the cross-examination by pressing Cohen on whether he had described Todd Blanche on social media as a crying little shit. Blanche's tone moderated as the questioning continued, but his central effort appeared to remain the same. He spent the afternoon attempting to convince the jury that Michael Cohen, Trump's one-time lawyer and fixer, is a self-interested liar who hates Trump and remains obsessed with getting vengeance against him. In a series of questions seemingly designed to paint Michael Cohen as more interested in damaging Trump than sticking to the facts, Blanche singled out comments by Cohen suggesting that Trump belonged in a cage, like an animal, and describing the former president as a Cheeto-dusted cartoon villain. Do you want President Trump to get convicted in the case, Blanche asked? Sure, Cohen replied. Cross-examination will continue on Thursday. They are off on Wednesday, but it could prove to be crucial. Cohen is the prosecution's 19th and final witness, apparently, likely the most important one. During his 2 days of testimony, it's claimed that Trump knew at the time that the 2016 hush money payment, which is at the center of the felony charges against him, would be falsely labeled legal expenses. I mean, there was literally a piece of tape on it that said legal expenses. Okay, I made that part up. The disgraced former president's lawyers indicated that to the judge that they could call an expert witness and that no decision has been made about whether to call Trump himself. Yesterday, the former president largely sat with his eyes closed, leaning back in his chair at the defense table, stirring only occasionally. All right, well, I'll bring you some sound clips analysis from it, but let me move on to some other headlines that aren't Trump on trial. Yesterday, the current president announced hefty new import fees on several Chinese products, including semiconductors and advanced batteries, an increase of tariffs on electric vehicles to 100% from 25%. The tariffs, President Biden said, are designed to protect American industries from competitors that he said were unfairly subsidized by Beijing. That sounds like America first, if you ask me. The president also officially endorsed maintaining tariffs on more than $300 billion worth of Chinese goods that were put in place by Donald Trump. Biden had previously criticized. How about that? People did say at the time that that was a decent move on specific tariffs on Chinese goods. But in an effort to add jobs and appeal to swing voters in the industrial Midwest, Biden's position has, of course, shifted. But he and the disgraced former president obviously disagree on much of the trade war that Trump started. All right, what else do I think is important? How about this? Harvard University and a group of student protesters announced yesterday that they had negotiated a deal to end a 3-week pro-Palestinian encampment in Harvard Yard. School officials will discuss students' questions about the endowment and quickly process petitions for the reinstatement of suspended students. But Harvard said it had not committed to taking any action. Their agreement followed similar deals to end encampments at more than a dozen other campuses, including Brown and Northwestern, in part to lessen the disruptions at graduation ceremonies. A few more headlines. The Fed chair, his name is Jerome Powell. He said yesterday his confidence in slowing inflation was, quote, not as high as before, and that rates would likely remain steady. Primaries yesterday in Maryland, Nebraska, and West Virginia, unexpectedly competitive Senate race among some of the highlights, and I don't have the results of that as I put together today's show. That happened too late for me to cover. News out of Baltimore where that cargo ship destroyed the bridge there. Apparently had 2 electrical failures the day before the incident, according to a government investigation, and much more detail out of that. Apparently it lost power. I think we already knew that, right? Though, before it hit the bridge. Terrible. Speaking of terrible, apparently the summer of 2023, last summer, it was the hottest in the Northern Hemisphere in 2,000 years. Scientists used tree rings to compare last year's extreme heat with temperatures over the past 2 millenniums. New study published in the Journal of Nature is where you can find more out about that. Extra greenhouse gases in the atmosphere from the burning of fossil fuels, of course, responsible for the most recent increases in Earth's temperatures, but other factors including El Nino, an undersea volcanic eruption, and a reduction in sulfur dioxide aerosol pollution from container ships may have contributed to the extremity of the heat last year. So it's not so simple, but there's still so much, obviously, that we can do to slow the speed of the inevitable that we have to adapt to. More about that with Anya Kamanetz on today's show. I was pretty immersed in the subject, obviously, last week at this conference. In response to pressure from the Biden administration, Mexico is busing migrants deep into the country's south. I want to dig more into that headline. And Congress is expected to pass a new bill that makes changes to the Federal Aviation Administration. The legislation, which funds federal aviation programs for the next 5 years, cements new passenger protections, adds new routes, and lets the TSA continue to expand facial recognition programs. More about that and a number of news outlets, because that was announced yesterday. The president and chief executive of the U.S. Travel Association, that's a lobbyist organization, called the renewal a big step toward vastly improving the travel experience. This is actually a pretty big deal for consumers, for air travelers, and this is brought to you, again, by the federal government and the Biden administration. Well, I'm not done with headlines yet. How about this? Yesterday, Alabama became the second U.S. state to ban lab-grown meat, joining Florida, which earlier this month outlawed the alternative protein. The governor there, Kay Ivey, she's a Republican, of course, signed the Alabama bill, which prohibits the manufacture, sale, or distribution of food products made from cultured animal cells into law now on May 7th. So 2 states now banning lab-grown meat. Supporters for the bill argue that it protects cattle ranchers and farmers from lab-grown meat competitors. And measures also address the notion that a cabal of global elites are promoting unnatural food. Lab-grown meat utilizes an emerging technology that uses animal cells to produce make in a laboratory that is meant for consumption. Of course, beef production, a major climate change contributor. Critics call the move misguided for several reasons, such as the first cultivated meat regulatory approvals passed in the U.S. less than a year ago. Others also note that the cell-based protein is an innovative alternative for advancing climate change, as the meat doesn't require land, crops, and water needed to care for livestock. The chief legal officer for the food technology company Upside Food said in a statement to USA Today, legislation that bans cultivated meat is a reckless move that ignores food safety experts and science, stifles consumer choice and hinders American innovation. It makes politicians the food police, and it ignores the food safety experts at USDA and FDA who have deemed it safe. But of course, Republican politicians could care less about climate change and always put profits over people, and they're in the pockets of the ag lobby, and we talked a little bit about that with Austin Frerick. A lot of Democrats are too as well, I should mention, but I bet you no Democrats are trying to ban a solution here. They're behind them normally. My take. The ban does not apply to impossible meat, which is made from plant-based ingredients. Officials in other states, including Kentucky, Arizona, West Virginia, and Tennessee, have similar measures cooking. I see what you did there with cooking. That's USA Today. You can find out more there. I'm definitely interested in that one. Apparently, according to the FBI, numbers came out yesterday, the rate of assaults on American law enforcement reached a 10-year high last year. More than 79,000 officer attacks reported, according to FBI report released yesterday. I'd be more interested in hearing about the reasons for that. There were 60 officers killed as a result of criminal acts in 2023, compared to 61 the year prior and 73 in 2021. Those numbers did decline over the last 3 years. There were more officer killings as a result of criminal acts in that time than any other 3-year period in the last 2 decades, according to the FBI. More than 230 officers were reported accidentally killed in the line of duty between 2019 and 2023. Most of those, 57%, died in vehicle crashes. Another 30% were hit by a vehicle. So interesting and tragic stats coming out of the FBI, but worth digging more into. I'm sure they'll be demagogued by those on the right who constantly talk about law enforcement as the most dangerous profession when there's like 10 other ones in America that are far more dangerous, including logging and different agricultural jobs, working in meat processing plants, and, of course, sanitation workers. Garbage men, I think, is one of the top as well. No less tragedy for those who lost anybody, and obviously it's a dangerous job, but just wanted to put some context to it. Well, apparently the Chinese leader is hosting the Russian leader. Xi Jinping is having Vladimir Putin over for a play date this week. It's more than 2 years since the two autocratic leaders declared a no-limits partnership to push back against what they consider American bullying and interference. Growing challenges from the West have tested limits of that partnership, but that is definitely a story worth watching and seeing what comes out of that meeting. In related news, Secretary of State Antony Blinken met with the president of Ukraine, Volodymyr Zelensky, in Ukraine, in Kiev, yesterday, assuring him that the American military aid is on its way at a challenging time for the country's war effort against Russia. Of course, talked a lot about that, got very much in the weeds with Bill B. in D.C. yesterday. A lot of great feedback on that conversation. And those, ladies and gentlemen, are your headlines for the past 24 hours. Who does it better than me at crunching those together, providing as much context and nuance as I can within about a 8 to 10 minute period of headlines. I love it. That's how I always wanted to hear the news repeated and reported at the end of the day, and that's why I do it that way. So thanks for your feedback. What do you like? What do you not like? Send me your news stories, your headlines, and now let's get to those sound bites for an even deeper look. Let's start with this merry band of sycophants, MAGA-death, as it's being called by one person on social media. Love it. Because apparently, like a couple weeks ago, Trump flashed his MAGA back signal. It's being written by Susan Del Percio, a Republican strategist at MSNBC, writing this. Apparently, baby Trump was seemingly frustrated by what he saw was a lack of public support, both inside and outside the courthouse. Since then, Lower Manhattan has hosted a veritable parade of sycophants, acolytes, and minions eager for their chance to support him silently during the proceedings and stridently on the pavement outside. Until Tuesday, when House Speaker Mike Johnson showed up with the motley MAGA crew, has been a mishmash of senators, House members, random state officials, and Trump staffers. It's also been a pageant of sorts for vice presidential hopefuls. Speaker of the House Mike Johnson has a real job to do. At times seemed committed to trying to do it, but even he apparently couldn't resist the summons of the big boss. And apparently, he skipped a vital session of the House to support Trump in New York. MSNBC put together a collage of those sycophants. Here's Chris Hayes introducing it and recapping it.
Donald Trump loves ranting about the prosecutions against him and the witnesses and the judge's daughter and the jurors. But how to do it without running afoul of his Manhattan gag order? Well, have thirsty Republican proxies do it for him. Last week, it was Florida United States Senator Rick Scott. Yesterday, it was Ohio United States Senator J.D. Vance. Outside the courthouse today, Trump's entourage of political sycophants and vice presidential wannabes swelled to include the ranks of Governor of North Dakota, multiple backbench congressmen, Vivek Ramaswamy. That guy's got a podcast, I'm sure. And even the Speaker of the House.
All of us are here as friends of Donald Trump, supporting him in our personal capacity.
President Trump is innocent of these charges.
The American people have already acquitted Donald Trump.
The judicial system in our country has been weaponized against President Trump.
This trial is a joke. This thing is a farce.
It is one of the most depressing places I have been in my life.
There's no crime here.
Where's the crime? There is no crime.
We have a Biden donor judge.
The real bookkeeping that we need accounting of is Judge Merchan's own family member collecting millions of dollars as a Democratic operative.
It's so corrupt and everybody knows it.
He couldn't say those things himself, a lot of them, some of which he could, but they say them for him.
Oh, right. Wow. Tough to watch. Tough to watch these guys, even though you hate them, sell out for Donald Trump. Really, what are they doing? Well, here's Lawrence O'Donnell's analysis of that.
The Republican Party.
Let me squeeze in a fact check on that lie you just heard about the judge's daughter making millions of dollars. The judge's daughter's never made $1 million. And so this is all part of the propaganda lie going on down there. But here's the most important thing that happened politically in America today, and it is an historic turn. The Republican Party has risen up boldly and bravely in defense of what they call adultery with porn stars, paying off the porn star secretly, altering your business records to cover up paying off the porn star secretly so that you might more successfully run for president. That is the position they took today. It'll be fascinating to see what their position is at their churches on Sunday about why they were at the porn star trial in another state where they don't live. But for them to be now the party that's completely and 100% in favor of sex of any kind with porn stars at any state of marriage you might be in, but totally opposed to any possible abortion option that might result from the Republican candidate having sex with a porn star. Yes. They have come down very solidly against that end of the whole story. If they can't let the story end that way, but they will defend every other thing that Donald Trump did in that room with Stormy Daniels and everything he's done about it since.
Oh, man, I love Lawrence O'Donnell's analysis. And I love him. I mean, he was so kind to Ava at Glenn Kirshner's event in New York, and he's always been kind to me. And I should get him on the show. So good. All right, well, let's step away from the hush money trial and all of the analysis of it. Like I said, it's overcovered. You can find plenty of it everywhere you want. But let's go to what's maybe undercovered. Yesterday at a congressional hearing, this is pretty fun. Jamie Raskin was tangling with this idiot from Kentucky, James Comer. And Jamie Raskin, again, gets the best of Comer, making him look like the fool that he is. Oh, such a mismatch, and I'm happy to share it with you.
Kentucky doesn't even have a carjacking statute. The most you could get someone on would be first-degree robbery, which is 50% of that time. And please, I stand corrected, Mr. Chairman, if I've gotten any of those facts about your state wrong.
Oh, that's right. We don't have carjacking.
Really? Because I just found a case in March from your state in the neighborhood of St. Denis in Louisville, where there was a serious carjacking.
Blue City.
Oh, actually, that was May. That was this month, May 7th.
If there's a carjacking in Kentucky, it'll be in Louisville. I can assure you.
There's no carjackings outside of Louisville in your state?
I'm sure in the course of history there's been.
Oops, I cut him off there. But anyway, Jamie Raskin's staff looked it up and a few moments later said this.
By the way, my staff is finding a whole bunch of carjackings that took place outside of Louisville. There's a town called...
It would be in Louisville. It would be in Louisville. If there are carjackings in Kentucky, they'll be in Louisville.
Do you know of a town called Hebron?
That's the suburb of Cincinnati.
Well, that's not. Oh, I see. But it's in the state of Kentucky nonetheless, right? It's a suburb of Cincinnati. Okay, well, they found one recently there. It seems like there are some carjackings outside of the border of Louisville, and I'm sure that the people of Louisville would want me to correct that misimpression.
Oh, so good. And you know who else is not to be messed with? From Massachusetts' 2nd District, Congressman James McGovern in an absurd battle about what an appropriate rule is in a committee hearing. And again, James Comer looking like a dum-dum. I love it. This is real fun back and forth.
Chairman Comer, you said it in your opening statement and in the letter that you sent to the Rules Committee that you request an appropriate rule for this legislation. What is that?
Appropriate rule that we hold criminals
accountable? Open
accountable?
rule or closed rule or amendments or what is a appropriate rule? What are you asking for?
An appropriate rule.
Well, what is the definition of that?
A rule that is appropriate. This is a rule this is the Rules Committee. We want an appropriate rule to go on the floor where we can do our job and hold criminals accountable.
What is your opinion, since you put it in your letter and you put it in your opening statement? What is your opinion of what an appropriate rule is? I mean, would an appropriate rule be a closed rule?
Whatever the Rules Committee deems appropriate.
Yeah, well, that's then. I mean, I asked the question because you used the word appropriate. You could have just said I request a rule, but you said an appropriate rule, and maybe the chair of the Rules Committee can tell us what an appropriate rule is. I'm not. My Republican friends like to use that, but I don't. No one can define it for me. I mean, I don't know what. Maybe it's hiding behind one of the statues in the Capitol or something. We can go look for it. But I'm just curious. I mean, you're asking us to bring a bill to the floor, and you ask for an appropriate rule, but you can't define what appropriate is.
I mean, with all due respect, Mr. Reagan-Barber, this is a very serious issue, and I think you're trying to make a joke out of it. And I go through this in the Oversight Committee with Raskin's little lapdog, Moskowitz. But
all right, well, that's enough. Raskin's little lapdog, Jared Moskowitz. All right, moving on. Let's go to another GOP congressman who thinks that Israel should just be allowed to obliterate Gaza.
If you look at what Imperial Japan did to the United States, we came back and said, basically, you're going to have to unconditionally surrender. And when they didn't, we had to drop the 2 atomic bombs on them. This is where Israel has every single right in the world to press this conflict further, to eliminate Hamas in whatever means they need and necessary.
Well, that guy sounds pleasant and insane. All right, let's go to the Rose Garden in the White House yesterday, where President Biden made remarks on his actions to protect American workers and businesses from China's unfair trade practice. Here's a little bit of that.
Smart approach. Compare that to what the prior administration did. My predecessor promised to increase American exports and boost manufacturing, but he did neither. He failed. He signed a trade deal with China. They were supposed to buy $200 billion more in American goods. Instead, China imports from America barely budged. And now Trump and the MAGA Republicans want across-the-board tariffs on all imports from all countries if reelected. Well, that would drive up costs for families on an average of $1,500 per year each year. It simply doesn't get it.
All right, there's just a little bit of that. And on the way out, President Biden was screamed a question by a reporter, and, well, here it is. This is a pretty good quip, a witty remark for the old man who defies the Sleepy Joe stereotype name-calling he gets put on while his predecessor is in court falling asleep during a trial over whether or not he paid a porn star to keep quiet to help his presidential aspirations. That's what we're talking about.
Trump said today China is eating our lunch. What do you say in response? He said China is eating our lunch. That's what Trump said today. We've been feeding it a long time.
He's been feeding them a long time. That's Joe Biden. President Biden yesterday with a quick-witted remark to a reporter yelling a question. And let's go back to Dumbtown, Earth 2, where Aaron Rodgers was talking to Tucker Carlson. A shame that house, wherever they were filming, didn't catch on fire. But stupid Tucker Carlson asked even dumber Aaron Rodgers what he thought about RFK asking him to potentially be his VP candidate.
When Bobby came to me and said, "Would you think about being my running mate?" And I said, "Are you serious?" I'm a fucking football player.
Ugh, Tucker Carlson's dumb laugh. Okay, well, let's get finally to some jokes, some laughs, huh? Brought to you by The Late Show with Stephen Colbert last night. Let's do it. I always like to end the news segment on a laugh. Let's see what Colbert's got in store for us.
When he took the stand this morning, Cohen testified that before Trump's 2015 presidential announcement, Trump told him, "Just be prepared. There's going to be a lot of women coming forward. Mikey, be warned. You're going to have to pay Karen, Stormy, Dusty, Misty, Christy, Crispy, Crunchy, Crinkly, and Grizzly. And, of course, one married woman, Mrs. Butterworth. That was my true love. Sweet lady, also very buttery." Then we got to the porn starriness of it all. Remember, Trump's whole defense is, "I never slept with Stormy Daniels, and I didn't pay her to be quiet. Michael Cohen paid her to be quiet." because he's such a great guy who I hope is torn apart by wild dogs. And I only paid him when I thought were legal fees. And if I did anything at all, I did everything I did, which I didn't do, to protect my wife from finding out the things I never did. And Cohen's testimony, never, always, and sometimes, and here we go. Cohen's testimony today was terrible for Trump. According to Cohen, after the Access Hollywood tape came out, they found out that Stormy Daniels was out there also shopping her story around. And Cohen testified, Trump said to me, "This is a disaster. Total disaster. Women are going to hate me. Guys may think it's cool. But this is going to be a disaster for the campaign. Unless everyone finds out about it someday and learns all the dirty details, goes on trial. I sit there sleeping and farting. Then somehow, and God knows how, it's good for my campaign." As far as this affecting his marriage goes, according to Cohen, Trump wasn't worried about Melania leaving him, saying, "Don't worry, how long do you think I'll be on the market for? Not long." Yes. Coincidentally, not long is how Stormy described it.
Well, there you go. Colbert last night on CBS, The Late Show. Well, that is your news for yesterday. I put a lot into it. Hopefully you appreciate it. Let me know what you like, what you don't like, and send me your news clips and your headlines anytime you want. standupwithpete@gmail.com, and tell your friends if you want a great news update. Go to Stand Up with Pete Dominic Daily. Now it's time to get to the original content. It is my interview with one of my favorite journalists of our time. It's Anya Kamanetz. And I've already talked a little bit about her, and I introduce her here again in front of this live audience of scientists and federal government folks and a few others at the conference I was at last week. I'm hearing from more of the folks that I met at the Headwaters Camp, Conservation, Climate Change, and Democracy, sponsored by the Climate Democracy Initiative and the National Conservation Training Center in Shepherdtown, West Virginia. Here is my conversation with one of the best, Anya Kamanetz. And again, we did this in a makeshift space and studio. Her mic was a little lower than mine. Sorry about that. Hopefully it's not too noticeable, but let's do it right now. Thank you, first of all, for everything that everybody shared outside. That was really cool to get to know each other. Looking forward to hearing, obviously, everybody's perspectives on each other's comments and each other's work tomorrow and throughout the day. And I just think that this can be an amazing give and take and networking opportunity. And everybody was really vulnerable with what they hoped to achieve and what they wanted to achieve, and also very humble in what you have already achieved. When Steve told me about this gathering and who I might want to invite, I was really excited to have the opportunity to invite my guest sitting next to me, because I will flatter her. And, well, I think she's one of the most important journalists of our time. I think Anya's work has been so vital for so many reasons, but most importantly for young people and their families. She covered education for NPR. I'm sure you heard her over the years on NPR. She's written 5 books now, and they're all super important, and I think have so much great research in them that help you, and you understand how to be a better parent and how to understand what's happening in the world. She's so heavily based on research and evidence and science, but I think her passion is unparalleled, and it always comes through. She writes and speaks and thinks about generational justice, about thriving and raising thriving kids, raising 2 of her own with her husband in Brooklyn on this changing planet. And she recently started her own newsletter called The Golden Hour after covering education for many years at NPR. And I want to talk to her about that work and why she pivoted towards it. Her latest book is The Stolen Year: How COVID Changed Children's Lives and Where We Go Now. And she's an advisor at the Aspen Institute and the Climate Mental Health Network. And she's heavily in demand from people like me who want to talk to someone like her because of her career and her work. And I'm so excited that you made the journey down here. I'm so excited that we have you here. And I'm really excited to have you join in conversation. So I'm going to ask her a few questions. We'll open it up if anybody wants to join in anytime. We'd love to have you. But please, a little round of applause for Anya Kamanetz for coming down here today. Thank you for joining me. I'm really excited to see you. I'm always excited when I have the opportunity to talk to you, and I have several times over the years in all of my various iterations of asking smart people questions. And so my first one to you is, you covered education for a premier news organization, NPR, for a long time. You pretty much did it all, from testing to COVID to everything else that young people, especially those living in tough circumstances, are dealing with in districts across the country. And you always surprise me with what you come out with and what you write. But I guess I was surprised that you left that beat, education specifically, but happy that you turned towards climate and kids. You're answering a lot of questions for us in your work now at the Golden Hour, but I guess I just want to ask you, why climate? Why kids? Why?
I think you know why, Pete. And one of the reasons it's been so fun to be in conversation with you over the last 6 or 7 years, or whatever it is, the convergence in our interests and also the willingness to really take the long view. But I think for me, I was an anomaly as an education reporter because I always looked at things from the point of view of students. And I started out covering education as a student journalist, then as a recent graduate. And I always thought of education as something that existed for young people, which there's almost no institution anywhere that was founded really by young people or for young people. So they always have multi-stakeholders, but I always look at it from, what are we doing for the kids? It's supposed to be for them. To my mind, and also listening to the young people that I've been listening to, climate change is the ultimate generational justice issue. COVID was something that I saw as affected young people very differently in lots of ways. The choices we made affected young people. A year in a 2, 3, 4, 10, 15, 18-year-old life, 2 years in their lives is very different than an adult's life. And so the choices we made, I looked at through those lenses, and climate change even more, right? 2080 is a year in your lifespan, then you're going to look at this problem very differently. And so that's what really made a call for me. And then also understanding from the other perspective, where is my space in the climate movement, understanding that young people in education and well-being are such a crucial part of solving this problem, made me see that I had a call and I had a place to go in that movement.
When you were at NPR, you're dealing with the NPR audience. And they're curious people, I'll just say that. But they're patient and they'll listen to long-form reporting, and there's a certain credibility with the reporting at NPR and other major media outlets, but certainly when it comes to having an editor and getting things right and so on. What do you think the difference is, before we get more specifically back to climate and kids, as people brought up here, how you communicate effectively on one network versus another network, radio versus TV, and remember print reporting and other types of journalism. What worked then? What works now to get these important messages to people? Because I always get so frustrated in media that it's all about outrage and divisiveness, and the biggest audiences are often the worst people doing the simplest divisive stuff. And I know that, and you know that, given our careers. How do you communicate these really important issues the way that you do, as some people have already said, and make it effective and have people listen?
I think there's always going to be complications and trade-offs. I think one of the, in talking about how democracy is entangled with climate change, to my mind, they have a common enemy, which is the concentration of wealth and power. And we know from, when you talk about a communication standpoint, I always listen to Upton Sinclair, it's very hard to get a man to believe something when his salary depends on him not understanding it. And so we have a lot of times a problem in mainstream media of not being able to call out and say plainly the things that we all know to be true. And I certainly felt that during the Trump years. I felt that during Black Lives Matter. I felt it with climate change to a certain extent, and a lot of issues in education as well. You make that trade-off, and I think for me now, I'm certainly reaching a smaller audience in some ways on some days, but I'm also being able to say exactly what I think and also bring my whole self to the table, which I think is really important, because this is emotional stuff. There's no way that you take in any of the facts of what's going on without having feelings about it, and being able to tell stories that involve people's feelings and put my cards on the table is something that I was willing to make that trade-off to do.
You have been, when did you start the Golden Hour?
Just about a year ago.
And it's a newsletter about living in the polycrisis, which is a word I didn't know.
Cool.
And so maybe other people don't as well. What is the polycrisis that we're all living in?
Yeah, I wrote this down actually, because it's also another really important way that we're connecting what we're talking about this weekend. So first of all, the Center for Naval Analyses and Military Advisory Board said that climate change was a threat multiplier. And then the Potsdam Institute for Climate Impact Research reported in 2024, the world is currently experiencing a worsening polycrisis, which is an entanglement and nonlinear amplification of many of the world's crises. So basically, climate change makes conflict worse. Conflicts can make climate change worse. The bombardment of Gaza in the first 2 months created a carbon impact equal to 20 small nations. So there's ecological ravages that come from, we're having risk of nuclear disaster with the Ukrainian wars. So there's interlocking, and then what also happens is it steals our capacity, right? It steals our focus, steals our capacity. Whatever bleeds, leads, and we pay our attention to that, and we're not dealing with the ongoing stuff. And so that's the wicked problem. Some people call it a super wicked problem that is polycrisis. Whether or not it's a useful concept, it's not a coincidence that everything seems to be getting worse at the same time.
That's what it feels like. Yeah.
But I think it's also important that there's learnings that go from one to another and parallels. And sometimes there's situations where there's multi-solutions. So I think it's important to look at the other side of the polycrisis, which is, for example, Israeli and Palestinian peace groups coming together have identified water use and climate as a common ground issue that they all agree needs to be resolved equitably.
When I first started coming here, it was to work with a group called SC3, the Student Climate and Conservation Congress, still going back this year, and then with the Youth Tribal Group as well. And I just thought it seemed obvious that we should start with young people talking about the issues, as you just said, that are going to affect them certainly more than they are us. You write that children are disadvantaged and disenfranchised group who deserve agency and voice. And that is what you're doing. You're talking to them and studying them. So what is your argument as to why we should be talking to and listening to kids and learning how to communicate, as a lot of people, all of us, are frustrated with exactly how we do that? Why start with kids talking about the most existential issue that will affect them no matter who they are?
Hopefully it's more listening than talking. But I think one reason is that there was a massive climate communication study that came out earlier this year across many countries, I think 65 countries. Love for future generations was by far the most powerful message across these groups. I'm seeing you guys nodding. More than job creation, more than protection. It was that evocation of that intergenerational connection that is going to turn up the urgency for the adult generation. So that's one thing. It benefits everybody to think about our connection to the young and future generations. That's number one. Number two is it's justice, right? We're talking about the group that is the most affected, and they deserve a seat at that table always. And I think the next part is that they have cracked the code on what makes this such an important issue. It is the younger generation for at least a decade that has refused to see humans as separate from nature, refused to see racial justice as separate from climate justice, has reinforced the point that we're all together and we're all in this together. And I think that is really what has raised the salience and the urgency of this issue. So they've made it a winning political issue through their own effort. And I think it's time that we all...
Seen a lot of young people lead this movement, and you're saying that we should shut up and listen, but why would we listen to kids who don't know shit? Like, why don't they just listen to me? I know, I'll tell them how life is and what's going to happen, and they just listen to me.
I mean, it's sad and true that there's a prevailing kind of concern trolling, I would say, also condemnation, moral panic around young people. Honestly, we don't even really recognize young people as the disadvantaged group that they are. It's still unusual to say that. And there is a discourse at least around what you can and can't say as far as race or ethnicity or class. But in terms of ageism, it's so out there. And that's not even, you wouldn't say that kind of thing in jest about any other group that you're not a part of. But
I would, but just to further the conversation. Yeah. No, but you're absolutely right. I wouldn't. Yeah.
I think that it's really not about the knowledge that they do or don't have. It is about the urgency that they're bringing to the problem. And it's not that when I talk to or listen to my Gen Z friends or the advisors to Climate Mental Health Network, nobody's holding all of the knowledge or all the expertise on this problem. This is a new problem. So we can listen and learn together, and we can have a conversation and a dialogue, but I'm respecting their position as far as this is important and this matters to me. And that's why you have shared power.
It seems like a lot of these young people are angry and doing things to get our attention and even inconveniencing us at times, which really bothers me to be inconvenienced by young people in the streets. What is working and what are you hearing from them? I mean, you study this, you talk to these people, the organizations that they often create themselves. How would you describe the movement as we see it right now? Obviously, a lot of people are focused on Gaza and a lot of young people are focused on that at the moment. Yeah. But there's a lot of intersectionality, as you just mentioned, with all this. But before that, after that, there is going to be these young people still organizing. What are they doing? What's effective? What's not?
It's really fascinating. I've had a really interesting front row seat on this for the last couple of years. So I served as a media point person in 2022 for what was called the A22 movement, which was Just Stop Oil, Declare Emergency, Last Generation across 11 countries in Canada and Europe and Australia. And they were having these Zoom calls and getting together and talking about press strategy. And I was like informally advising them. Still, don't tell anyone because I was still working for NPR. But these were not just kids. They were grandmas getting arrested. And these were people who were really motivated. This is coming out of Extinction Rebellion, an offshoot of that. And people that were really motivated to treat the crisis like a crisis. And I think what struck me over and over again was the absolute emotional truth of what they were putting forth. Everyone here understands the reality, I think, of what's going on, and they were simply putting that into action and enacting it. And what's interesting to me is that the rest of us are not doing it. So I was at the Climate Reality Project training in New York a couple of weeks ago, the biggest one that they ever had. Al Gore, from The Inconvenient Truth, he gives his slideshow and he trains you to be a climate reality leader. And it's a very big tent gathering, 3,000 people. There's lots of government people, there's policy people, there's academics, there's business, and there's students. And John Podesta came on the last day, and the Sunrise kids, college students, stood up and interrupted John Podesta. They're like, you need to tell Biden to declare a climate emergency. This is an emergency. We need to treat it like an emergency, unlock emergency powers, and stop fossil fuel development. And they're marched out of the room immediately and marched out of the venue completely onto the street. And it's so striking to me because no one there disagreed with them. Like maybe you could say this isn't the right demand. I have a conversation about it. But in substance, we just listened to Al Gore tell us for 2 hours that this is an emergency. We know it's an emergency, but we're delegating the disruption to a few kids who are honestly they're not just performing. They're very upset. They're crying. They understand that this is urgent and they're using their lives. They could be networking. They could be trying to get a job, but instead they're being obnoxious and standing up and saying what everybody there knows. And so what I wanted to know is why are we forcing the kids to do that for us? Why can't we all agree and understand that it is an emergency? And why are we making some people pretend that they're activists and other people pretend like we're the normal people?
You say generational justice is the lens of looking at challenges facing humanity from the perspective of the young and future generations. And you write, it turns out a child-centric society is better for just about everyone. For one thing, it's more fun. I'm a bit of an ageist when it comes to policymakers being of a certain age, not because they can't relate or because they don't want what's best, but because they don't actually have to face the consequences of the policies that they're necessarily making. And I'm a radical in that I think it would be amazing if we had really young people making these policies because they're the ones that are going to have to be living with them. How do we get to that point where young people are more in charge of actual policy making, or at least more influential?
I didn't come up with this idea. I think it draws on a lot of indigenous teachings about 7 generations, where actually you're the center of that. It's 3 generations back and 3 generations forward. And I think that it takes a little bit of imagination. A lot of times people put it through their children or their grandchildren. I think that's fine. I think that's great. I certainly, my children are people that I think about, but I also think about it in a more long time, and I think that all of you that work to steward natural resources are familiar, or geological resources, right, that there are timelines other than human that are important to consider when we're making decisions. And I think I know of like processes, I believe it was in Switzerland, where they'll actually have a seat at the table for someone who represents 100 years from now. So not a child, but even like farther than that. And what decisions would we make if we have a metaphorical seat at the table for someone in 2100?
The Supreme Court won't allow that, actually, unfortunately, that child that are. You've been writing a lot lately about how you think a big part of this paralysis, and you can talk about that, people feel in regard to the climate crisis is our own individualistic society where we're encouraged to express our values mainly through consumer choices, which obviously are totally inadequate to the size of the problem. You say that lots of us we just don't know about how people power works, and so people end up identifying as, quote, not an activist. But the climate crisis, of course, impacts everyone. Everyone needs to be doing their own part, and individualistic actions won't cut it, so we have to do better. Could you expound on those consumer choices and individual actions and how we communicate that they don't make as much of a difference? Because I thought when I got a Chevy Volt and solar panels in 2010 that I was not only saving the world, but at least that my kids saw me plugging in a car from when they were really little. That was the difference that I thought I was making, if I'm being honest. But what are you saying? That I didn't make any difference at all? I didn't do anything?
I think that personal choices are acts of devotion and symbolism that help us live in accordance with our values and show, yes, our
be the
family,
change you want to see, yeah.
That is, it's all good. The problem is the greatest trick that BP ever pulled was like the invention of the carbon footprint and making us all think that we could consume our way out of this problem. And also particularly because I do focus groups and talk to parents, to mothers particularly, mothers are internalizing a huge amount of climate guilt. And they relate it instantly to their own choices vis-a-vis what they do and don't recycle, what they do and don't compost, how much they buy online on Amazon versus secondhand. And this is such a huge suck of energy that we could be using to get together to push on the people in power, right? And what is it? We need extended producer responsibility, not consumer responsibility. Helping people see, and I think the first step is that you're not alone, right? And Bill McKibben always says, what can I do as an individual? Stop being an individual. Where are you connected? And how can your choices be influential not only to your nuclear family, which is great, but to people around you in a bigger way?
What have you seen that's effective in terms of working together, whether it be for young people or elsewhere, locally, state, federal, international?
Honestly, I am privileged to live. I'm a homeowner in Brooklyn, and my local electeds are incredibly great climate advocates. And Emily Gallagher is a state assembly member, my local one. She helped fight for Local Law 97, which is the strongest clean buildings law in New York City. In New York City, one of the strongest clean building laws in the country. And that's going to make a difference. And I'm going to see it around me. Now, we have to still organize our neighbors to make sure that this doesn't get weakened and that landlords don't get to weasel out of it. But I see it. Cities are a great unit of climate action because there's an accountability there. You can see people and make changes on that level. So I think that that's one example that I've seen in my life.
Yeah, that's a good example because I don't think we think about that as well. Urban changes on renewable energy and so on in urban buildings. I always wonder why there aren't solar panels on the roof of every single building, although it seems like that initiative is starting to take off in different cities as well as internationally.
It is. And then there's like the development laws, like changing zoning laws so that more people live in a smaller area and drive fewer miles.
Right. Yeah. You mentioned money and power earlier, wealth and power, and whether it be in government or education, you quickly slipped in, and we could unpack a little bit. BP is the company that created this idea of your own personal carbon footprint, reduce your own carbon footprint. And these companies and industries have colluded for a long time on messaging to make us think now that we need plastic even still in so many different ways. But how do you fight back against that when they have all of the money and all of the wealth? I was just addressing a bunch of teachers unions Saturday in Maryland, and they're up against the most powerful, you know this as well as anybody, people in the state and in the country. How do you fight that money when you don't have it?
And this is very personal for me. I'm from Louisiana, so I've been living with the lies told by Exxon and Shell Oil and BP my entire life. And you fight them, the only thing you have is the truth. And if you're good at it, you have social media, which allows for a little bit of asymmetric messaging. And I think that there's a chance in this day and age for the truth to win out when it's effectively told. And I think that when people start to see and feel that power, like how did big tobacco come down? They had all the money, they had all the PR, but on the other side there was the truth, and there were enough people willing to tell that story.
I want to open it up for anybody that wants to join this conversation. As you can hear, Anya knows what she's talking about when it comes to this, the latest reporting, the latest research, and is sharing it in her newsletter all the time. And hopefully everybody here will subscribe to that. And I'm going to share this with my audience, this conversation. So everybody listening, if you haven't subscribed to the Golden Hour, you're missing out on really important reporting. But last question I have for you is, we talked about this just before we got started tonight. There's a certain exhaustion that comes with activism. And as adults, becoming part of any movement, for me right now, I'm absolutely exhausted fighting the people in my town over the school board.
Yeah.
It's beats the hell out of me, and I can't stop because I'm so, angry, but so are they. If it's young people, however, it's almost like, for me, I feel like it's my responsibility. I'm letting down my community. I'm letting down my own kids if I don't do these things. But kids aren't supposed to be activists. They're not supposed to be part of change, or maybe I've got that wrong. What do you say to a young kid who you've heard from who says, listen, I'm exhausted. Can I take a break? Can someone take my spot? What about the cynicism and exhaustion that even young people feel, much less adults, when we're trying to create this change?
Yeah, I love that question. And I think there's a really complex emotional mosaic that's going on, because to me, there's a whole lot of people that are anxious, paralyzed, in denial, not moving on this issue. There's just so much denial going on. And then there are the people that are right there in it, and they are really tired. And so we need somehow a more sustainable movement. And I think a lot of times in social movement world, they talk about the choir, where it's you continue to sing and you finish your breath and someone else is singing, so the note continues, right? So there's a rhythm to it. And in nature, there's rhythms to things, right? Nothing blooms all year round, right? So how do we understand that and have a sustainable movement ecology, and how do we transmit that to the kids? So I wrote recently a piece where I interviewed young activists who were astonishingly wise on this. I talked to a 23-year-old. He spent a cumulative 30 days in jail for blocking roads to stop old growth forests getting cut down. But he's in danger of being deported back to Pakistan from British Columbia off of his student visa because of his civil disobedience. And he's in jail reading Gandhi. And there's a whole tradition here that I didn't know about because I thought I was invincible. I thought I'd never run out of energy to fight this. But I realize now that I need to understand joy. I need to understand the beauty of having a meal with some people that I love, people that are in the fight together. This is a long haul. We all have to be sustained. And that's an incredible piece of wisdom from a 23-year-old who is undoubtedly going to continue to make huge changes in the world because of that wisdom.
I know this is antithetical to what you said, but how do you maintain writing and covering this issue for the Golden Hour? I'm glad I covered just about everything that's important and impactful, certainly obviously climate and democracy all the time, but I also cover a whole bunch of things. You're pretty heavily focused on this right now. How do you not burn out?
Make space for grief and fear as part of what I'm doing. And I'm ready for that, and I have space for it. I'm not trying to push it down or deny it. I want there to be a broader, richer conversation about the feelings that come. And I don't know if that keeps you out of burnout forever. I obviously spend a lot of time on joy, a lot of times on the things that I love, being in the moment. Gratitude is huge. But also not being afraid to be upset or not being afraid to be sad or have an off day and realize that it's not all on me.
I have so much gratitude that you're here. If you're not the best person covering this right now, you are one of the best people. To have you here is such a privilege and an honor for us, and I'm really happy that you're doing this work. I just thought of one more question because it's specific to these folks here. A lot of these people, I won't call them out, but they told us who they were already, have been working in the federal government across a couple of administrations. They've seen the change. They can't always openly talk about it, but if you talk to them one-on-one off the record, they'll tell you exactly what they lost, what they gained, and how they all performed miracles doing the work that they had to do underground for 4 years, how they were not allowed to say certain words, and they probably just had to whisper in the hallways and couldn't send emails, and I can't imagine. And so we applaud you for doing your job and not quitting, which could have been justified. But you've also been, and others as well, critics of this administration who often make amazing, probably the most amazing investments in renewable energy on one hand, and then on the other hand, open up new drilling leases and so on. How would you grade and see this current administration where we have an opportunity maybe only for 180 more days and hopefully for longer, to that's why we're together, I think. How would you grade what has been done right now? Speak directly to Shiva.
I was extremely emotionally invested in the IRA. I was very pissed that the caregiving provisions fell out of the Build Back Better, because that was something that was very personal to me that I saw the need for coming out of the COVID pandemic. So that's not climate related, but it is kid related. I think stand or fall. I think that Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez gave an awesome answer to this recently. She was like, for the leftists in the room, who do you want to fight with? Who do you want to negotiate with? Who do you want on either side of that table? Because it is not the job of activists or anyone who's in a space. I am now out of NPR. I can say whatever I want about what I want to have happen. It's your job to push as hard as you can for what you can get done. And I believe that there is a multitude of voices out there, and I'm not the person sitting at the power in the front of the room to say what's possible. I think that said, I am a huge supporter, including a financial supporter, of Climate Defiance, who are the people that showed up and told Joe Manchin to go fuck himself, like in person, and got like strong-armed pushed away by one of his aides. Because the issue,
I think the exact quote was, "You are a sick fuck."
You're a sick fuck.
Yeah.
That's right. And did massive numbers on Instagram. Then John Podesta met with them. Like you don't always get into power by becoming polite or being a networker. Mm-hmm. And he's the guy who started that. He's 30 years old, and he worked in traditional climate policy work for a while before he was like, you know what? I think I have a better idea. And there is a place for that person. I'm a really big proponent of multitude of tactics. And so for me, of course, it's not enough. I'll give him credit for what he did. Those things can be both true.
Yep. Disruption matters. Not everybody most of us can't be a lobbyist. And poverty doesn't have a great lobbyist arm, much less the critters. I constantly think, who was it? Somebody said, I really don't like people.
Yeah.
And I just think that, like, for a lot of us, you're not alone. I love people. I love meeting new people, but I think a lot more about all these insects and creatures that many of you work to protect, and that they don't have a voice or a lobbyist. So that's why I don't mind saying certain things to Joe Manchin, who is not long for this government. All right, little round of applause for Anya, everybody, huh? Thank you very much for being here. All right, well, I got to cut it off there. We did go to questions, but that was off the record. I hope you appreciated that conversation with Anya Kamanetz. I'll get more people from that awesome conference, the Headwaters Camp, Conservation, Climate, and Democracy. I had some great conversations and made awesome contacts with some heroic folks doing amazing work. I'll be having more of them on and talking with them right here on Stand Up. But please go subscribe to The Golden Hour. That's Anya Kamanetz Substack. More information on her in the show notes. Let her know that you heard her here. And thank you for joining me today. Can't do it without you and your support. Your paid subscription is what keeps me going here. So patreon.com/Pete Dominic, and write a rating and review on Spotify and iTunes. Subscribe on all the social medias. Read the email that I send every day. If you don't, check it out. There's a picture of vitamin N Nature for you each and every day if you're a subscriber. Check that out. And I look forward to seeing you at tomorrow night's Hangout, which we do pretty much every Thursday at 8 p.m. You get the invitation if you're a subscriber. John Carroll's often there. He was last week, and it was amazing. I should share last week's Hangout right here on the podcast. It was so good. But here it is right now, John Carroll taking us out as he does every day with our song.
Stand up, you gotta stare the devil straight in the eye. We got to let him know it's his turn to go. See it clear when all you hear is a lie. Don't get up off of your butt, down off of your fence. Even if it ain't a very friendly audience, well, they'll begin to listen when you start making sense. And you stand up, stand up. No need to point your rifle to defend your town. Just stand up, stand up. You know they can't deny you what you're laying down. Oh, you better stand up, stand up. Show your face of every color, yellow, black, red, and brown. She's the place where every lost child will finally be found. There's only one thing to do before we stand our ground, and that's stand up, stand up. Well, the founding fathers saw a land for all. They had to stand up, they had to stand up. They had a keen imagination for a crystal ball, drawing all the plans for a stand up. But all they had to go again. They had to stand up. All right, they had to stand up. We got to stand up. We got to look the devil square in the eye. We got to let him know it's his time to go and make it clear when all we hear is a lie. Why you lying awake wondering where the money all went? It'll be the cost of freedom that'll go unspent. You can see him flee the scene of that experiment if you stand up. All right, we got to speak up, we got to reach up and raise your voice in every way you know how. Don't be toes up, you got to show up. Ain't no better time to do it but now. No need to pledge allegiance to no wanton tribe. Rise up, show obedience to the voice inside, and listen well and it'll tell you not to run and hide. It says stand up.